I was sitting in that upscale restaurant, a place where I normally felt invincible. The atmosphere was elegant, with a soft scent of lavender and notes of jazz in the background. Everything seemed designed to remind me of the life I had built. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, a break from the intense routine. But at that moment, the night began to transform. I saw her. She walked in arm with him, her lover, her eyes shining in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. At first, my body froze. The scene seemed to come out of a nightmare. My wife, the woman with whom I shared dreams, plans, laughter and silence, there, completely given over to another man. She passed right by me without noticing my presence, so absorbed in the moment with him. I felt a wave of repulsion and humiliation rise through my chest, and my hands clenched in an impulse to fight back immediately. But control got the best of me. I needed a moment to process it all, to understand how this blatant betrayal happened before my eyes. I slowly got up and walked towards the table where the two were. She still hadn't noticed, smiling almost childishly, completely unaware of what awaited her. When I stopped next to her, she finally looked up, and the smile disappeared. I saw her face lose its shine, as if the mask she wore had fallen off. She knew. And at that moment, with a firm and cold tone, I blurted out the words that seemed to boil inside me, "It's all over between us." Her face contorted, going from surprise to panic in seconds. She tried to mumble something, but the words were jumbled up in her mouth. The lover looked at me with a mixture of contempt and arrogance, as if he had a right to be there. That mixture of emotions and faces, of words that were not spoken, of stories not told, all of that collapsed before us. I turned and left, but as I crossed the room, a flood of memories flooded me. I remembered our travels, the nights we laughed until dawn, the moments when she swore I was the only one. The little promises she made, the way she hugged me saying we were invincible. Her every word, every smile now became a farce. She lied. In every hug, in every touch, there was a shadow of falsehood that I hadn't seen until that moment. When I left the restaurant, the night seemed too cold, as if the world had decided to punish that betrayal as much as I had. But the anger inside me began to transform. It wasn't just revolt. It was an uncontrollable need to expose that lie, to make her pay the price for everything she destroyed. Suddenly, the idea took shape: I wouldn't let that betrayal be forgotten so easily. She would lose everything that still mattered to her, just like I had. Days passed, and my plan began to come to life. At the first opportunity, I began to tell the truth to those who knew our story, but without fury, without rushing. I knew that the impact of my every word, spoken at the right time, would be devastating. And one by one, our friends came to know her as I now knew her, the wife who, without hesitation, had betrayed me. I saw friendly faces change as they realized who she really was. Our conversations, which were previously full of complicity and affection, became dry and punctuated by the discomfort of those who are forced to face the consequences of their choices. I saw the panic growing in her eyes, a fear that she tried to hide, but that became more evident with each averted glance, with each failed attempt at rapprochement. And it was then that she began to beg for explanations, to justify her actions with a trembling voice, a mix of despair and regret. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, as if her words could erase the scars she caused. "Never wanted to hurt." I repeated, in disbelief, as she tried to rationalize her actions, tried to turn it all into an insignificant mistake. But I didn't listen to her anymore. For me, it was too late. Her attempts to repair the irreparable sounded like insults with every word that came out of her mouth. And I, who had previously loved her almost blindly, now found myself in the position of doing myself justice. I let her feel, firsthand, the weight of her own betrayal, the isolation of losing those who once supported her. She, the woman who always seemed to have control, now found herself alone, suffering the consequences of her own poison. Everything was unfolding in a way I could never have predicted. With each new person who discovered the truth, her circle closed a little more. It was almost ironic to see the woman who was once the center of all attention, now being shunned even by friends who swore never to abandon her. And with each new look of judgment she received, I felt a little freer, as if the weight of that betrayal was lessening. But despite everything, the story didn't end there. I knew that sooner or later she would try to confront the reality I created for her. She, who was so trusting before, now came to me looking for answers, begging for forgiveness, trying to rescue what little was left of our story. And in every plea for reconciliation, in every tear she shed, I only felt the bitter taste of irony, reminding me that every pain she felt now was a reflection of my own. How far would she go to restore what she destroyed? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never encourage betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they are created to show how betrayal can devastate lives, destroy bonds and leave deep scars. Get ready now for a shocking story, full of twists and turns and breathtaking moments. Good story, and remember, loyalty is always the best path. In a busy and elegant city, where the fast pace of life mixed with the shine of apparent perfection, lived the couple Alan and Rachel, well-known and admired figures among friends and colleagues. Alan was a determined, meticulous and always elegant businessman. Professional success had come early for him, and his name was respected in his social circle. Rachel, always smiling and engaging, was the personification of charm and intelligence. With an intense look and an ease of communication that enchanted everyone, she seemed the perfect complement to Alan. They met at a gala organized by one of Alan's clients, a night that remained in their memory for the intensity with which they exchanged glances for the first time. Alan, who never considered himself a romantic man, was deeply attracted to Rachel's aura. There was something about her that went beyond outward beauty, a mix of intelligence and self-confidence that made him want to know more. Rachel, enchanted by Alan's subtle humor and the way he always maintained a reserved air, felt attracted to something she had never experienced with other men, the feeling of being challenged. That night, between glasses of champagne and carefree laughter, they built the beginning of a story that would be marked by ups and downs, but always with the promise of complicity. The connection between them was quick, almost like a spark that ignites and then turns into fire. Before long, Rachel moved into Alan's luxurious apartment, a space that reflected his sophisticated style, with minimalist decor and expansive views of the city. There, she began to build a home, adding personal touches that softened the coldness of modern furniture. Life finally seemed to fall into place for both of them, and the two created a routine where laughter, conversations and gestures of affection were frequent. Alan, always used to discipline and planning, relaxed when he was with her, discovering simple pleasures that had never crossed his mind before. Rachel, in turn, was delighted to discover his generous and protective side, which was always attentive to her needs and the little surprises that made her smile. Over time, the relationship solidified, and they became a much-admired couple. At social events, it was common to hear comments about how well they matched each other. The love they felt seemed like a solid rock, something that would overcome any obstacle. Alan and Rachel cultivated, for years, this image of a perfect couple, by each other's side at city parties, on carefully planned trips and, above all, in the intimacy of the home they shared. Together, they shared ambitions and dreams, building not just a life of appearances, but a foundation that seemed unshakable. However, behind all this harmony, there were small frustrations, those that appear between the lines of routine. Alan, consumed by work, spent countless hours at the office, with the ambition of expanding his business to other cities. He often arrived late, and Rachel, who had initially admired his commitment to his work, began to feel invisible. She tried to talk, but his monosyllabic responses showed that Alan's head was elsewhere. Even though the love was there, Rachel found herself increasingly lonely, questioning whether her place in that life was really what she wanted. The nights when I stayed up waiting for him to arrive began to turn into long silences, into smiles that, although present, no longer carried the same shine. Alan, in turn, did not realize the extent of the void that his absence caused. He believed that his dedication to his work was a proof of love, a way of guaranteeing Rachel the comfort and security that he always wanted to provide. He never imagined that, by striving for success, he could be losing, little by little, the connection that had previously been the basis of his relationship with her. Alan felt a discreet pride in seeing Rachel adapting to his world, accompanying him to business events and sustaining the conversations and appearances necessary to strengthen the image of the perfect couple. However, he didn't realize that this pride was hiding a flaw that, over time, would become a wound between them. Rachel, on the other hand, began to look for something that reminded her of the woman she was before Alan, a woman full of her own dreams, with desires that went beyond being the wife of a successful businessman. The routine that seemed safe began to feel like a burden, and she began to wonder if she was willing to give up her essence in favor of a life where, increasingly, she saw herself as a supporting player. Her doubts grew and, on some occasions, Alan caught her lost in thought, as if she were somewhere else, far away. A quiet but significant turning point came on a business trip that Alan had to take alone. Rachel had planned to accompany him, but at the last minute he discouraged her, saying it would be a quick, boring trip with nothing special. She pretended not to care, but for the first time, she felt a detachment that seemed deeper than a simple physical absence. On the nights she was alone, Rachel walked through the empty rooms of the apartment and, in every detail, realized how much she had shaped her life to fit Alan's desires. That bothered her, and she found herself reflecting on how it felt to have her independence silenced. When Alan returned, he was greeted with the same smile as always, but something in him began to notice a subtle change. Rachel seemed more distant, more introspective, and as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping through his fingers. However, Alan chose the path he knew best, focusing even more on his work. He believed that, with time, Rachel would return to how she was before, without imagining that that silent choice would be what would open an irreparable distance between them. Even with time and the wear and tear of their routine, Rachel and Alan maintained the facade of an ideal couple, with hugs in public, friendly conversations and mutual praise when friends commented on the strength of their relationship. Both basically carried an admiration that made them believe that there was still something to recover from. Rachel continued by Alan's side, trying to rekindle the flame that once united them, but each attempt seemed to come up against the coldness with which he treated her, an indifference that made her question whether, in a suit, she was loved. As time passed, sincere smiles gave way to rehearsed expressions, and affectionate words were replaced by mechanical, almost memorized phrases. At this point, his closest friends began to notice small differences. Those who knew them well noticed Rachel's distant look at some parties, the way she smiled without really getting involved, Alan's slight discomfort when the subject turned to the couple's plans. Although they continued to circulate among the same people, Rachel and Alan seemed to be increasingly distant, as if an invisible line separated them. Even though both tried to hide it, the most attentive eyes caught the signs of wear and tear, and, for those who really knew them, it was clear that something was changing, even if no one dared to comment. Alan, in his relentless pursuit of success, was oblivious to the emotional impact he was having on Rachel. He believed that she understood him, that she would endure moments of loneliness for the sake of a promising future. Rachel, in her growing introspection, began to glimpse possibilities outside that relationship. And so, the two moved away, without confrontations or fights, but with a coldness that seemed like an abyss impossible to cross. Each one, in their own way, lived in a bubble of apparent comfort, without knowing that that heavy silence was, in fact, the first crack in a castle they had built with so much effort. While the relationship continued like this, without major ruptures, but also without the connections that previously united them, their lives continued, as if nothing was wrong. However, what lurked between the lines was a harbinger of what was to come, a silent storm that would soon confront them with truths that none of them were prepared to face. Alan was beginning to get used to the routine that he and Rachel had established, a carefully choreographed dance where each one followed their own steps, but always maintaining the safe distance that time had imposed between them. He, submerged in work commitments, little noticed the growing gulf between them. Rachel, in turn, felt increasingly distant from the man with whom she once believed she could share everything. Her attempts at rapprochement were responded to with distracted gestures and empty words, an indifference that hurt her in an almost imperceptible but implacable way. It was one night, after another silent dinner at home, that Rachel decided to go for a walk. I felt that the air was too heavy, almost suffocating, and I needed to breathe a little away from Alan's distant presence. Walking through the streets, she mentally relived every little disappointment, every moment in which he had chosen work over her, and a silent anger dominated her. It wasn't an explosive fury, but something cold, that made her question where the man she had once fallen in love with was. In a cafe near her apartment, she met up with an old friend, someone she had known since college. His name was Ethan, a man who, unlike Alan, carried a lightness in the way he lived, always willing to listen and share his own experiences without the weight of responsibilities that seemed to ensnare Alan. Ethan and Rachel talked for a long time, talking about the past years, the inevitable changes and, without her realizing it, that meeting became a refuge. The feeling of being heard, of finding true empathy, awakened something in her that seemed dormant. And Ethan, always patient, never pressured her, respecting her space, but showing an interest that Rachel hadn't felt in a long time. Weeks passed and, without Alan noticing, Rachel and Ethan began seeing each other frequently. At first, they were casual encounters, little getaways that helped her find a little color in the world that, at home, seemed so faded. But, little by little, the friendship gained layers of affection, and each encounter seemed to pull her further away from the relationship she had once built with Alan. She knew something was changing inside her, and even as she tried to push away the idea that there was something more between them, it was as if an invisible thread was pulling her toward Ethan. On the other hand, Alan continued his routine as if nothing had changed. For him, Rachel was a constant in his life, someone who would always be there, regardless of his absences and distractions. The stability he believed he had built blinded him to what was happening around him. Deep down, he saw Rachel as just part of a carefully assembled scenario, something he admired but was far from his priority. However, in moments of silence, perhaps when tiredness took over, he remembered the conversations he had with her, the way she used to smile at him, and a slight feeling of loss crossed his mind. But he quickly dismissed these thoughts, convinced that the solidity of the relationship would not be shaken by these lapses. One night, when Rachel was returning home after a date with Ethan, something different began to pulse in her chest. I felt a mixture of guilt and excitement, as if I were walking a path from which there was no return. Ethan had become a constant presence in her thoughts, and the way he made her feel was something she could never ignore. He was not just an escape, but a reminder of what life could be outside those walls where silence reigned. Even though she didn't want to admit it, she felt more and more involved, more and more willing to risk something she had never imagined. The tension was growing, and Rachel knew that, at some point, she would need to confront reality. But, at that moment, what mattered was the feeling of being desired, of being with someone who saw her completely. She spent the next few hours wondering how she got there, how a once solid relationship now led her to seek solace in the arms of another man. And as the weight of guilt began to set in, the excitement of the new experience pushed her forward, ignoring the consequences that would inevitably come. It was during one of these nights, in a discreet restaurant, that Ethan looked her in the eyes and, with a touch of hesitation, confessed what he had been holding back. "Rachel, I can no longer pretend this is just a friendship. I care about you in a way that goes beyond that." His words seemed to hang in the air, and Rachel, surprised by the intensity of the moment, felt her heart quicken. Part of her knew that hearing that would be a point of no return, but at the same time, it was exactly what she wanted. She wanted to feel important to someone, wanted in a way that Alan had long since stopped showing. After that meeting, she returned home amidst a whirlwind of emotions. Alan, as usual, was engrossed in his laptop, reviewing documents and responding to emails, unaware of his wife's state of mind. Rachel watched him for a few moments, looking for a spark, something that would make her feel like there was still a reason to be there, but all she saw was a distant man, oblivious to what was going on around him. The feeling of loneliness intensified, and, without thinking much, he went to his room and fell onto the bed, fighting the guilt that was now beginning to eat away at his thoughts. Over the next few weeks, the encounters with Ethan became more intense, and Rachel finally gave in to what she had been resisting. In a moment of fragility, enveloped by the affection he offered and the security she felt at his side, she gave herself over to a passion that made her rediscover a long-forgotten side of herself. The betrayal, now consummated, filled her with a mixture of pleasure and anguish, a duality that followed her in every encounter. And even when she was with Alan, her mind betrayed her, taking her back to Ethan, to his touch, to the whispers that made her forget the emptiness in her life. Alan began to notice subtle changes in Rachel. She was more distant, her smile seemed forced, and the lightness with which she previously viewed conversations between them seemed to have disappeared. Something inside him began to suspect that there was an invisible barrier between the two, but at the same time, he couldn't admit the reason for that change. To him, Rachel was still the woman he knew, the one who would always be by his side. However, one night when he arrived home early from work, something caught his attention. Rachel was on the phone, and from the tone of her voice, Alan noticed a sweetness he hadn't seen in a long time. Curious, he tried not to make noise as he approached and, without meaning to, he heard her last words, "I can't wait to see you tomorrow." Alan stopped in the middle of the corridor, feeling a cold take over his body. The doubt, which until then seemed impossible, was now a reality. He didn't immediately confront her, but the feeling that something was wrong took root in his mind. The following night, while Rachel said she was going to meet a friend, Alan decided to follow his instincts and discreetly followed her. He parked the car some distance away and watched as she entered a restaurant. Minutes later, she saw a man approach her and, to her horror, noticed the intimacy with which they greeted each other, the complicit looks and the smiles that she no longer shared with him. Alan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Every second of that scene seemed like an eternity, and he didn't know if he was capable of bearing what he saw. When Rachel and Ethan sat down at the table, Alan, still in disbelief, decided to enter the restaurant. He approached slowly, and time seemed to freeze when Rachel finally saw him. Alan stared at Rachel and Ethan across the table, words caught in his throat, as a cutting tension filled the silence that had fallen between them. Rachel, in shock, seemed unable to formulate a response to her husband's fixed and intense gaze. Ethan, not knowing what to do, remained silent, his face betraying a mixture of shame and guilt. Alan, breathing deeply, broke the silence with a voice that trembled between anger and contained pain. "How could you?" he murmured, his voice low, but filled with an intensity that reverberated in each word. "After everything we've built, is this what you wanted?" Rachel tried to compose herself, looking for something that could justify what had happened, but all she managed was to stutter a few disjointed words. With each attempt, I realized that there was no explanation that could alleviate the emotional burden of that moment. "Alan." She finally murmured, trying to choose words that could remedy the impact. "I'm very sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." But he interrupted, without giving her time to continue. "Wasn't it supposed to happen like this?" His voice now rose slightly, each word poisoned by the bitterness of betrayal. "So what should it have been like, Rachel? In secret? On the sly, so that I could continue living a lie?" Ethan, feeling the weight of the situation, looked at Rachel with a hint of regret, trying to indicate that he no longer wanted to be part of the scene. However, Alan stared at him with cold determination, preventing any attempt to escape. "You stay too, Ethan," Alan said, with a tone that made it clear that the confrontation was inevitable. "You did this together, now, they will face the consequences together." Rachel began to fidget, visibly uncomfortable and teary-eyed. She tried to touch Alan's arm, but he instinctively moved away, as if her simple contact was unbearable. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Rachel said, in a low, shaky voice. "This all was a mistake, I know." Alan laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh, just bitter incredulity. "A mistake? He repeated, the word coming out with disgust. How many times did you have to make this mistake to realize that you were destroying everything we had? Her gaze averted, and Ethan remained silent, as if he had resigned himself to the role of observer in this emotionally charged clash. Alan continued, leaving no room for excuses. I believed you, Rachel. I thought we were a team, that we were in this life together, and now I discover that, while I was dedicating every minute of my time to us, you were busy in another relationship. What is this then? Love? Passion? Or just the desire to throw everything away? Rachel, now visibly shaken, muttered through tears. I don't know. I was lost. And Ethan was someone who listened to me when you weren't there. So that was it? Wasn't I there to hear you? Alan replied, and the pain in his voice was palpable. Rachel, if you had only told me, but no, you preferred to stab me in the back. She wiped away her tears, trying to compose herself. But Alan interrupted her before she could say anything else. And do you know what's most curious about all this, Rachel? He continued, with a look that reflected a mix of conflicting emotions. I discovered much more than your betrayal. Something you hid from me, something that destroys any possibility of you justifying what you did. Rachel stopped, looking at him with a mix of panic and surprise, and a deadly silence took over the room. Alan took a deep breath before revealing the secret she never thought he would discover. I know you cheated on me before, with another man, even before Ethan. I thought I was the only one carrying this guilt, but I was wrong. And do you know how I found out? He paused, his gaze fixed on her, wanting to see his wife's every reaction. You told a friend of ours. Just someone who didn't have the courage to hide it from me. The revelation fell like a weight on Rachel, who found herself unable to deny it, and her gaze lost any trace of control she had maintained. I didn't know you, she tried, the words failing, her face contorting into an expression of guilt and terror. Alan continued, each word a sentence. Yes, Rachel, I know. I know you betrayed me before, and yet I tried for so long to give you a chance. I thought it was my fault, that maybe I had failed you in some way. But now I see that this is you, a person who destroys everything around you. Rachel began to cry, unable to hold Alan's gaze, while Ethan, in a mix of discomfort and resignation, seemed to find no way out of that scenario. Alan stood up, eyes steady, without any more hesitation. You two are exactly what you deserve in each other, he said, his voice full of contempt. You can have each other, but know that I have nothing left to give you. Alan left the restaurant with firm steps, but his every movement seemed to be an effort to control the explosion of feelings that consumed him. The revelation that Rachel had betrayed him before, that his trust had been torn apart not once but twice, weighed like an anchor in his chest. He walked the streets, still hearing in his mind the echo of her words, the empty justifications and the desperate eyes that he now saw as windows of a profound falsehood he had never suspected. Upon entering the apartment they shared for years, every object seemed to have lost its meaning. The framed photographs, the hand-picked furniture, the small gifts that represented important moments for the couple, everything now seemed like a fake scenario, created to deceive their senses. Alan felt the need to remove every memory of that relationship. He collected the photos, one by one, throwing them into a box, pushing away each shared memory as if they were debris from a life he no longer recognized as his. Loneliness, however, began to take its toll. Even with the betrayal revealed, there was something inside him that struggled against the void that Rachel had left. The certainty that she was no longer who he thought he was did not eliminate the fact that he had deeply loved that woman, that he had given her all of himself, that he had placed in her the trust he had never given to anyone else. He wondered at what moment she had transformed, at what point their love had been lost. The dilemma between anger and sadness mixed together, creating silent anguish. Days passed, and Alan found himself facing a moral dilemma that gnawed at him. He could just disappear from her life, leave everything behind and rebuild a new life away from Rachel. But part of him wanted more than that. He wanted her to understand the weight of what she had done, to face each of the consequences. Alan knew he had a choice. He could walk away quietly, or he could act so that Rachel's pain was proportionate to the damage she had caused. It was on one of these nights of reflection that he decided to pursue something other than divorce. Alan began meeting with friends and acquaintances, people who attended the same social events as Rachel. He would sit in casual meetings, business meetings, and dinners with close friends, and subtly tell parts of the story, making his side clear but without lying or distorting the facts. He didn't ask for compassion, it just exposed the truth, raw and impactful. The reactions were immediate. Many, shocked, offered unconditional support to Alan, while others were unable to hide their displeasure upon discovering who Rachel really was. Rachel, in turn, began to notice the changes around her. Conversations became tense, encounters with once pleasant friends were now filled with looks of judgment and discomfort. She tried to ignore it, but with each indirect comment, with each uncomfortable silence, she felt shame settle in, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Rachel understood that Alan was somehow exposing everything, revealing what she had tried to hide. She sought comfort from Ethan, but his lover now seemed even more distant, almost as if their relationship was a mistake he would rather forget. Ethan, who once seemed determined and passionate, now avoided public meetings with her, fearing that his name would be associated with the scandal. Rachel found herself surrounded by a loneliness that she herself had created, a kind of emotional prison where she increasingly found herself trapped, with no way out. He felt the weight of what he had done, but he was still desperately trying to save some part of his old life. One day, Rachel tried to confront Alan, hoping he still had some trace of compassion, some willingness to listen to her side. She found him in the office where he now spent most of his time and, without any ceremony, entered, determined to talk. Alan, upon seeing her, just crossed his arms, his gaze cold, without offering any opening. "Alan, can you hear me, please?" She began, in a voice that tried to sound firm, but that betrayed an obvious fragility. "Listen to what, Rachel?" He replied, his voice emotionless. "Hear how you destroyed everything we had. How did you fool everyone around us? Or how sorry you are now that people know the truth." She hesitated, feeling small in the face of his coldness. What she feared most was indifference, and there it was, exposed in Alan's expression, as if he no longer saw any value in her. "I made mistakes," she admitted, in a low voice. "But it wasn't out of malice, I was lost." Alan laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Lost? You were very sure of what you wanted when you decided to betray our trust. Lost or not, you knew what you were doing, Rachel. You chose this." She tried to get closer, but Alan backed away, as if her simple touch was unbearable. "I just wanted," she murmured, feeling the words get lost, unable to express the mixture of regret and despair that was growing inside her. "I just wanted you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you." "It's too late for that," he replied, in a tone that seemed definitive. "It's no longer about what you wanted or didn't want. This is about what you did, Rachel. And now, you will bear the consequences of this." Rachel felt the weight of his words like a sentence. The love he had once felt for her was now an unbearable burden, something he refused to carry. She left the office in silence, her face marked by a sadness that seemed to intensify with each step she took. There was no longer any way to escape, her old life was in ruins, and the only thing left was to face the devastating reality she herself had created. Meanwhile, Alan felt torn. He had managed to expose Rachel, show everyone who she really was, but the satisfaction he expected didn't come. Instead, the emptiness in his chest remained, a feeling of irreparable loss that he couldn't ignore. On some lonely nights, he wondered if there was any way to rebuild his life, to find a new direction after all this. But every time he thought about forgiving, about trying in some way to take back what was left, he remembered the betrayal, the dishonesty, and the weight of the pain kept him firm in his decision to move forward, alone. Still, he knew the story wasn't completely over. Months have passed since the office confrontation, and what was left of the life Alan and Rachel had built seemed like a desolate landscape beyond reconstruction. Alan dedicated himself entirely to his work, immersing himself in new projects and using every minute to distance himself from the memory of what his married life had become. He had moved into a new apartment, a place where there was no trace of Rachel, and although the space was modern and cozy, the emptiness there was palpable. Loneliness surrounded him every night, but the pain was no longer so raw. Instead, it was like a scar that, although it was there, became more bearable every day. Rachel, in turn, faced a more bitter reality. The public exposure of his betrayal had resulted in almost complete isolation. The couple's friends, those who previously welcomed her with smiles and hugs, now avoided her gaze at social gatherings, and few risked maintaining any contact. She tried to move on, but rejection was a constant shadow. In her most desperate moments, she thought of Alan, wondering if there would ever be a chance for reconciliation. However, with each attempt to get closer, whether through messages or calls that he ignored, it became clear that Alan no longer saw a place for her in his life. Ethan, contrary to what Rachel expected, did not remain by her side. After the confrontation, he quickly distanced himself, avoiding any links that could associate him with the scandal. Rachel realized, with painful clarity, that he had never really been willing to face the impact of his choices. Within a few days, he stopped responding to her messages, and Rachel understood that his presence had been temporary, a momentary filling for a void that was, in fact, much deeper. The man she had thought would be her comfort had turned out to be an illusion, and the bitterness of that discovery hit her with full force. Now, she was alone. Alan's life, although apparently stable, still carried traces of what had happened. On one of the nights when he was reviewing the divorce documents, about to finalize the entire process, he was overcome by a feeling of discomfort. As much as he wanted to turn the page, the marks Rachel had left were deeper than he wanted to admit. He questioned whether he would ever be able to trust again, whether the love he once felt would be possible in a new relationship. The memories of each betrayed promise came flooding back, and he wondered if he would be able to allow anyone close enough for him to try to rebuild his life. One lonely night, while looking at the city through the window of his new apartment, Alan received an unexpected message. It was from Rachel, who was begging for one last conversation. He hesitated, but, on impulse, decided to meet her in a cafe, aware that, perhaps, a last goodbye was necessary to put a definitive end to that chapter. Rachel was waiting for him with an expression that mixed regret and hope, and Alan, as he sat down opposite her, noticed that the woman in front of him was just a shadow of the one he had once loved. The silence between them was heavy, but Rachel finally broke it with a low voice, almost a whisper. "I know I made a mistake, Alan. I know nothing I say will justify what I did, but I needed you to know that, no matter how lost things were, the love I felt for you was real." Alan watched her for a moment, feeling a silent sadness well up inside him. "Rachel, I also believed that everything was real. I believed in us and everything we had. But what happened?" He stopped, searching for the words that seemed to want to escape. "There is no place for this in my life anymore. I need to move on, away from this, away from you." She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. I knew there was nothing more to be done, that was Alan's definitive answer. And as he stood and walked away, Rachel felt the weight of loneliness that would surround her forever, a constant reminder of her choices. Alan, as he left the cafe, took a deep breath and felt that something inside him had finally closed. He walked the streets, now free to start over, determined to create a life where trust and respect were unshakable. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment and tell us your opinion. And if you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories. Remember, we never support betrayal here, we are here to show how it can destroy lives. Until next time.